So, welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a special presentation, a book presentation of a new text out from Oxford University Press entitled Return of the Gods, Mythology and Romantic Philosophy and Literature. So, it has rave reviews so far by Karl Emerichs, Anthony Bruno, Benjamin Crow, and Naomi Fisher, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Ware here today. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much. And, we were talking earlier how we've been wanting to do this for ages. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really feeling grateful to be part of this community that you've created. I'm a subscriber and I watch all of your videos. And, I'm just so impressed at the sort of the collective enthusiasm people have for classical German philosophy broadly construed. I love it. And, everyone's feedback and the comments, you just get the sense that there's this vibrant community of fellow-minded people who have this shared passion. So thank
Yes,
you.
well, thank you so much for that. So, Dr. Owen Ware is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. Dr. Ware's areas of research include Kant, post-Kantian philosophy, German and British Romanticism, global philosophy, especially classical Indian philosophy. He's held research fellowships through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation of Germany. Dr. Ware has authored several books, including Fichte's Moral Philosophy, Oxford University Press 2020, Kant's Justification of Ethics, Oxford University Press 2021, Kant on Freedom, Cambridge University Press, Indian Philosophy and Yoga in Germany, Routledge 2024, which I've read and it's fantastic. And of course, Return of the Gods, Mythology and Romantic Philosophy and Literature, Oxford University Press 2025. I'm going to read the read up about the text and then we'll jump into the questions.
That sounds
So
great. Yeah,
I am super excited about this book.
I'm excited that you're excited.
So why was mythology of vital importance for the Romantics? What role did mythology play in their philosophical and literary work? And what common sources of these influence inspired these writers across Britain and Germany at the turn of the 19th century? In this wide-ranging study, Owen Ware argues that the Romantics turned to mythology for its potential to transform how we see ourselves, others, and the world, engaging with authors such as William Blake, Friedrich Schlegel, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Friedrich von Hardenberg, Novalis, Percy Shelley, Ware shows why they believed that neither perception nor reason alone can sustain a vision of the unity of all things. A new mode of cognition is necessary, they claimed, one that revives the poetic origin of mythology and reveals our own myth-making powers. Return of the Gods investigates the rise of mythology in British and German traditions and the Romantics and practices of reinterpreting old myths and inventing new ones. Their shared aim was nothing less than to elevate the human imagination to higher stages of self-development, in which philosophy and poetry, as well as the intellect and imagination, form an integrated whole. Far from calling us to return to the past, the Romantics' work on mythology points us to a future where we can live in harmony with the personal, social, and natural worlds we inhabit. Owen Ware combines intellectual history, philosophical analysis, and literary criticism to offer a bold reflection on why mythology mattered for the Romantics and why it still matters today. So I can't tell you how wonderful this text is and what a time to get it at when there's such political upheaval, tumultuous divisions in culture and politics. And the it seems like the main theme is this self-fragmentation from mind and nature, or from a medium that links philosophy and poetry. And there always seems like we're striving for some form of new cognition or new understanding of ourselves. And so I guess the first chapter really grasped me because I'm not as well read as of Schiller as you are. And I was wondering if maybe we you could take us through this distinction or this tension between naive and sentimental poetry that leaves room for, the new form of myth making, from the unconscious to the conscious, this striving for wholeness and this concept of, um, I think you call it unified cognitions.
No, this is fantastic. I felt that Schiller was a really good starting point for this project because he does such a fantastic job really articulating the problem that would be taken up by the Romantics. And he also points to certain solutions that I think are very friendly to what the Romantics go on to do. The problem that Schiller wonderfully diagnoses is, as you mentioned earlier, the problem of fragmentation that seems to be really characteristic of the modern experience. And fragmentation comes in different forms. So there's fragmentation of the self, this sense of being divided, internally conflicted, especially between our rational and so-called non-rational natures. Then there's fragmentation in society. There's a sense of alienation from others. There's fragmentation within nature and our sense of disconnect from nature. And you're right that there's something particularly relatable about what the Romantics are doing today. And I absolutely love that. This sense of, the 200 years separating us and the Romantics just kind of dissolves now, given that all of these problems that they're struggling to figure out and come up with solutions to overcome, we're still living with those problems. And, what makes Schiller a really good starting point is he says, well, look, there's a sense in which we can look back at past systems of poetry and past systems of mythology. His main source is Greek mythology. And he says, this is really an opportunity for us to confront our own imagination before it was, in a sense, fragmented by the powers of rationalism and the powers of modernity that have left us fragmented today. So it's an opportunity, according to Schiller, to gain insight into ourselves. We can kind of study the human mind and especially the human imagination that he takes to be the root and source of mythology. We can study that through ancient systems of mythology and gain a better understanding of the human mind prior to this fragmented, fractured state. And what we see through ancient mythology is a sense of permeability between self and others and the world, and even permeability between the human realm and the realm of the gods. And he thinks what that reveals is a certain poetic way of experiencing the world. And he calls this naive poetry. And what he means by that is there's a sense of immersion in experience where those sharp distinctions between self and not self have yet to crystallize. And it's a kind of childlike state of humanity. And what's important to emphasize, I should say this now, is that Schiller's not saying we should try to go back to that state. Like we can talk about prejudices against the Romantics, but very common misconception is that they're nostalgic for something in the past, childhood, or, this kind of ancient culture in which everything seems to be in harmony and in peace. Schiller is saying, no, we can never go back. And the Romantics would agree with him. The point is not to go back. The point rather is to learn something crucial about the faculty of the human mind and the way in which the imagination works prior to being divided and fragmented as a way of getting sort of a sense of where we can go moving forward, in which we're now striving towards a new kind of wholeness. In my book, I use this phrase complex wholeness to designate a category of where we are to go in the future, where we're not actually trying to regress to some pre-divided state of selfhood. We're rather trying to move forward into a more integrated state of selfhood in which reason and sensibility are now harmoniously coordinated. And so Schiller's point is that we can actually get clues of how to make progress forward by going back to the past and studying ancient systems of mythology. And to just quickly answer your question, he thinks that modern poetry is characteristic of this sense of longing for something that is missing in life, and he calls that sentimental poetry. And so he thinks it's kind of a symptom of the modern experience that you feel fragmented, you feel incomplete, you have a yearning for wholeness, but you don't quite know what it is that's going to satisfy you and that it's going to make you complete and that is going to make you whole. Schiller thinks that we can satisfy these yearnings for wholeness by going forward and achieving a certain kind of integration of self where reason and sensibility are now in balance. I think this really became, for the German Romantics, a very important claim because they think, yes, we can find our way to wholeness by studying mythology. And mythology then becomes part of their solution to overcoming fragmentation. And that's really the striking claim that my book is trying to unravel and explore.
Yeah, you do this very nicely in the introduction, where you say when you're speaking about romanticism, you're not trying to speak of some nostalgia for the past, but a medium that can help this conception of self-fragmentation. I really appreciate that because when you bring up romanticism these days, people just think it's they have this very, fallacious understanding, and you do a very good job of clearing up what the romantics are doing. There is this distinction, I think. There's a tension between what you call a primitive understanding of mythology, which relates to
Mhm.
Hegel and Herder, and it has
Mhm.
something to do with, how the human consciousness unfolds, and then what you call myth making or mythology. Can you maybe talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this became for me a really helpful distinction to kind of navigate my way through this complex terrain of mythology and myth interpretation at the turn of the 19th century. What I discovered is that hundreds of years before Schiller and the Romantics were writing, there were really two dominant models of myth interpretation in wide circulation. And I just give the labels Platonism and primitivism in my book. And really, they're not just different, they're kind of like polar opposite models of understanding myth. Platonists say that the first myth makers, like Homer, were actually sophisticated philosopher theologians who deliberately concealed under the veils of symbol and allegory and myth this kind of fundamental wisdom regarding the true nature of the self and the world. And so, this idea, I mean, it sounds quite striking, and it is. This idea that myths actually conceal wisdom and that the first myth makers were actually philosophers. That's the Platonist view. And the reason it's called that is that it became a very popular view among a group of thinkers that we now call Neoplatonists. And in my book, I mostly call them late antique Platonists. And they defended this view. Now, the opposite view you find variously upheld by people like Spinoza and Herder, and I think it really becomes influential for later figures like Hegel. The idea is that the first myth makers were not philosophers. They were sort of natural poets, not sophisticated in their intellectual abilities, but maybe naturally inclined to artistic self-expression. And the idea is that there's something almost primitive in the sense of primordial being expressed and conveyed through myth, and that only later philosophers have gone back and, in a sense, extracted a kind of allegory or symbolism from that more primordial artistic self-expression. And so that's the model of primitivism. And you'll see in my book, I show that the Romantics were aware of both of these models, and they were doing really creative things in sort of creating what I call a hybrid model, where they thought there was an element of truth in both of these models.
Moving to maybe the next part of the next chapter, when we get into this distinction of new mythology, what is this manifesto for a new mythology? And whereabouts, where does this emerge, this idea of a new mythology?
Yeah, so I mean that was really the question that sort of haunted me personally for a number of years. And really it was one of the key questions that put me on the path to writing this book. It was a sense of puzzlement regarding the romantic idea of a new mythology. I found so um, kind of bizarre and enigmatic and interesting, and I wanted to make sense of it. And the book is the results of that. So officially, the phrase new mythology was coined mid 18th century by Herder, and it was later picked up by the Romantics. And there's this fragment called the Oldest System Program of German Idealism, and it itself is surrounded with an air of mystery because there's no consensus about who really stood behind its claims. What we do know is that its handwriting is traceable to Hegel. So Hegel wrote it, but it's not clear whether he was, in a sense, the author of the ideas or whether he was transcribing something. A lot of scholars think that maybe Hölderlin or Schelling was the actual author behind the claims. And in this fragment, that was only later rediscovered in the 20th century, in this fragment, you find this claim that what we need in the modern age is a quote unquote new mythology. Now, in my book, I try to do two things. I try to elucidate what this new mythology was for the German Romantics, and then I also try to show that something similar, something strikingly similar was going on the British side of the Romantic tradition. And you can see this clearly in Blake, and I also trace it through Coleridge, Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley. They don't call it a new mythology, but I try to show that that's what they're doing. Now, to answer your question, the impulse, as I understand it, behind this project of creating a new mythology kind of connects back to what we were talking about earlier in the sense of what the Romantics think that we need is not to escape myth. That's more of the rationalist Enlightenment attitude, that as individually and as a society, as we increase our powers of reason and reflection, we're gradually doing away with things like mythology and fairy tale and even art. And, the most extreme version of this thesis is sometimes attributed to Hegel, in which any kind of sensory representation will eventually be overcome and transcended in the progressive development of the human mind. The Romantics were really of the view that our task is not to do away with myths, but to create new ones. And the reason they're really committed to that is they think that it's only through symbols and stories that we can really have a kind of connection to that which exceeds normal powers of perception and reason. That yearning for wholeness, they think, brings us to this desire to be connected to something infinite and absolute. But reason and perception can never really be the medium or the interface or the point of contact to that infinite or absolute. And they think we can only have, in a sense, sensory, poetic, allegorical, mythic connections to that thing that we are seeking. And so their project then becomes writing new stories, creating new symbols that are meant to be pointing our path forward to this new kind of connection, a new kind of wholeness, overcoming of fragmentation, overcoming of a disconnection between self and other and mind and nature.
I think you did such a great job of kind of lucidly kind of navigating us through chapter 2 and 3, especially with Blake and Coleridge and Wordsworth. Why do you think in Schlegel's Gespräch, why do you think he wants a new medium to be a kind of philosophy of idealism? Why does he kind of stress this strain of idealism?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that he, in this dialogue on poetry, and in the speech on mythology, which you can imagine, I spent a lot of time working with that particular speech on mythology. Um, he does have the character of Ludovico say that idealism it already points to the new mythology that we have to bring into existence. And one way I think to unpack that claim is that he thinks the philosophy of idealism is exhibiting the freedom of the human spirit and the freedom of the human mind. So he's understanding idealism here in a way that I think is meant to be quite broad. And I mentioned this in the book. I think when Schlegel speaks of idealism, at least in this text, it's inclusive as a definition to encompass both people like Kant and Fichte. However, I think the emphasis points more to Fichte. And I say that because it's much more of putting freedom as a kind of a first principle, in which it's the subject that stands in a relationship to positing the world. Not in the sense that it creates the world, but in the sense that it kind of creates a relationship to the representation of what is not self. And that exhibits a certain kind of freedom. And Schlegel's ambition in the project of invoking, also creating a new mythology, was to have symbols and stories that are in a sense conveying that freedom of the human spirit to create the world, kind of like to realize that we are all like artists in this process of creating the world we inhabit. And what that opens up, and this is the really bold claim, it opens up the possibility of recreating the world. So if we've been living in a kind of worldview in which we see ourselves as determined and unfree, we have that power to recreate a kind of a new narrative, a new worldview in which our freedom is now being exhibited, but it's being exhibited through symbols and stories. That's why the emphasis comes back still on mythology, but now it's a new mythology.
This idea of enchantment and de-enchantment as well.
Yeah.
Could you maybe flesh out this concept of de-enchantment and enchantment? And I believe it's with nature, with mind and nature, this distinction.
Yeah, this is really a theme that you'll find running throughout all of the romantics, whether they're British or German, this sense of disenchantment that comes with a feeling of being cut off from the natural world. Now, this is where you can see why there is this misconception of romanticism as being nostalgic, either for childhood or for some kind of early point in human history in which we seem to be harmoniously connected with nature. And I think it's a misconception, but they do think that we can learn from looking at ancient human history. And in the case of Wordsworth, he thinks we can learn from our own childhood and our experiences in childhood before we developed our powers of reason and reflection that created this sense of disconnect from nature. We can learn about what it meant to live in a state of consciousness in which the barrier between ourselves and nature, again, it was more permeable. There was more of a sense of being immersed in the world. And what went with that sense of immersion was a feeling of enchantment. You find Novalis really developing this theme of everything seemed magical in past stages of human history or in our own childhood lives. And as we become adults, the world becomes disenchanted. We become more rational. And there's a sense in which nothing is sacred anymore. There's no deeper meaning to anything. Nature just seems to be a lifeless mechanism. And what we end up pursuing is just, instrumental goods like securing our well-being and trying to make money. And there's no sense of wonder left in the world. So there is a sense in which the Romantics are trying to recapture a sense of enchantment and wonder. But again, what I argue is that it's not by going back or regressing to an earlier state, it's actually by going forward.
So turning now to the British, Blake, Coleridge, and Wordsworth, what is their part in this, in their relation to Romanticism?
Yeah, so what I discovered pretty early on in my research is that well before the German Romantics were talking about a new mythology, you have someone like Blake living in London, very much dedicating his life to doing exactly that, creating a new mythology through his poetry and through his artwork. The timeline really struck me because I was like, okay, he hasn't encountered the German Romantics. That was impossible. So, what sources of influence inspired him? And a lot of the book is an attempt to uncover the common sources of influence that the British and German Romantics shared in common. I actually trace it all the way back to the late antique Platonists that I mentioned earlier. And what I show is that Blake was really picking up on this old idea that mythology can be a medium for connecting philosophy and poetry. That's a claim that turned out to be, to my own surprise, a very old claim. So, what I do in my book is I try to show that independent of any awareness of the German Romantics, you find people like Blake on the British tradition very much engaged in this same project for the same reasons. The basic idea that you find Blake developing, and it's picked up by Coleridge and Wordsworth, is that to overcome fragmentation, we can't just use our rational powers alone, nor can we just rely on our powers of sensation. We need to use abilities that we find exhibited in artists and poets and myth makers and storytellers, because what they're doing is they're exercising the human imagination in special ways. And you'll find this claim in my book, which is that there's this higher power of the imagination that you see exhibited whenever there is a kind of union of opposites or a coincidence of contraries. And you find people like Blake doing this. In fact, all of the romantics, when they're actually engaged in myth making, they create, whether it's in their novels or their poetry, these beautiful visualizations that combine opposites. Or, just to give you one example, in Novalis's novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, you have this image of a flower with a human face hovering at its center. And so there's this sense of you can visualize the human and the non-human almost like merging together, coming together, this idea of nature and spirit not being fundamentally divided, but that there's some point of union between the two. So what I discovered is that this ambition to write a new mythology that is presenting this kind of sense of the deeper unity of things that is deeper than our awareness of dualities and divisions, you find it on the British side too. So the book is really putting the British and German traditions in conversation and goes all the way up to later second generation romantics from the British tradition like Keats and Shelley. In my book, I'm really focusing on earlier texts by Coleridge before he knew German and before he went to Germany. And a key text for me became the Lyrical Ballads, which is a text that both Coleridge and Wordsworth published together. And so a lot of poems that people know, maybe you read them in high school, like Kubla Khan or Tintern Abbey, these actually come from this collaborative volume called the Lyrical Ballads. And it's the fruit of their research and thinking and writing from their earlier years before they were fully exposed to the German tradition. So you can see that was an important book for me because it was kind of more evidence that they were doing something along the lines of myth making and creating a new mythology, independent of any awareness of what the Romantics were doing off in Germany.
Before we merge into return of to mythology with Holderlin and Novalis, maybe I can ask you a question that I probably should have asked you at the beginning. How did this fragmentation of ourselves begin? Does it happen in the Enlightenment with, the rationalizing gaze and mechanization and Newtonian physics? Where does this plea for a medium to connect, consciousness and unconsciousness, ideal and real, subject and object, unity? Where does this plea for unity come from? And where does this fragmentation start?
Yeah, I think. an idea that you find a lot of these authors developing is that there's a kind of process of fragmentation that occurs at the individual level, and that it also occurs on the larger historical stage of human life. And so the idea is that in ancient history, we exhibited a kind of form of life and a culture that was either not fragmented or not so fragmented as it later became. People lived more in connection with each other and the natural world. The sense of a boundary separating even the human and the divine and was, like I said earlier, more permeable. Historically, the Romantics think, yes, the modern age that brought about forms of natural science that are explaining the world according to a principle of mechanism, suddenly that gives us a picture of nature that is like a machine. And a machine doesn't have any purpose. A machine doesn't really exhibit creativity or freedom. And so then the worry becomes, well, are human beings just like parts of this machine? Are we too equally determined? Is there no real spontaneity or freedom within the human being? So the modern age brings about all of these conditions that contribute to our feeling of disconnect and fragmentation. Schiller even talks about the ways in which modern society has created divisions of labor so that everyone has to become a specialist in one corner of life. It's like you're not actually called upon in modern society, and this is, so relevant today. I love teaching this to my students because they can relate to it. Like, you're called upon a profession that is really just asking you to develop one aspect of yourself at the neglect of other parts of yourself. So nothing in modern society is encouraging you to become a whole person. And the same is true, according to Schiller, when you look at the human sciences. They've become increasingly fractured because they've become increasingly specialized. And you just learn a whole bunch about a little kind of fragment of human knowledge at the expense of the whole. So you could say the factors on a historical level are coming from different directions, from, top to bottom, bottom to top. But the Romantics thought that a similar process happens within the lifespan of each individual. So back to your question of what is the source of fragmentation, we've just been talking about fragmentation that occurs within human history, but then there's also fragmentation that happens within each person's individual life. And the idea is that children are not fully conscious of distinctions between self and world and self and other. So they do live in a more kind of naive state of unity and wholeness, where things are not yet fully differentiated by the light of reason. And as we become more rational, as we become more reflective, there's a deepening of that sense of separation and isolation and alienation. That's why, according to the Romantics, as we become sort of teenagers and around the age of 20, we start feeling like something is missing in life. I have this sense of longing for wholeness. I want to be complete, but I don't know how to satisfy that completeness. And the Romantics talk about how a lot of us turn to like pleasure seeking as a way of like fulfilling this deeper need for wholeness. We think pleasure or happiness will fulfill it, but it doesn't. It just kind of endlessly postpones it. But they do think that what we need is to reactivate and re-enliven our powers of imagination. And that's why the Romantics put so much value on art, becoming an artist, and eventually turning your own life into a work of art. So it's not just art in the narrow sense of the word, it's sort of looking at your life artistically, poetically. That's part of the new mythology that they are very much trying to bring into existence.
And sometimes they call it a rational mythology, mythological reason. What is this element of the rational that's allotted to mythology?
Yeah, so that's a term that comes from this so-called system fragment, that what we need is a mythology of reason. And the way in which I understand that is that what reason, in this sense, is contributing to mythology is it's giving the ideals of freedom, equality, community. The problem is that we're disconnected from those ideals. And so what we need is the imagination to create symbols and stories that foster this sense of our interconnection as a human community, and even what Novalis calls the world family, this sense of being connected to nature and to the non-human animal. Uh, they think that we can't just reason our way to that connection because it's rooted in feeling as well. And so the imagination can elicit these feelings of sympathy and connection, but it does so through symbols and stories. And so a mythology of reason is kind of taking these ideals of unity and equality and fraternity, but then giving them a clothing that activates the imagination and activates feelings as well.
I'm actually really looking forward to this next question because maybe some of the viewers don't know this, but you're actually translating Novalis's um, Heinrich von Offendingen. Now, this kind of return to mythology and working towards a new mythology, you have Schlegel's Lucinda, Hölderlin's Hyperion, and Novalis's Heinrich von Offendingen. Why these three texts, and what relation do they have towards a new mythology or working towards a new mythology?
I spent a lot of time working on those three novels, um, which was part of what made writing this book so fun and challenging because I wasn't just engaging with philosophical texts, I was also engaging with poetry and novels. But I loved that challenge and it was really exciting. Now, what I try to defend in my book is that these three novels, so Hölderlin's Hyperion, Schlegel's Lucinda, Novalis's Heinrich von Ofterdingen, these are three instances of the Romantics trying to create a new mythology. The reason this is important is that a lot of what the Romantics say is at the level of theorizing about mythology or talking about why we need a new mythology. But where do they actually get down and do it as artists? One thing that you have to admire about the Romantics, irrespective of your philosophical leanings, is that they weren't just philosophers. They were also creative writers, poets, novelists, artists. And so this is, I argue, an instance in which we see them trying to create a new mythology. And what I develop in my book is this claim that they're all, in a sense, trying to find that medium, that bridge, connecting us to these ideals of reason, ideals like freedom, equality, unity, fraternity. And they're creating different symbols and stories that are explaining how we can individually and as a society find ourselves overcoming fragmentation and achieving a certain kind of wholeness. I argue that Novalis goes the furthest in that direction. And it was from working on this book that I decided to work on Novalis in a more concentrated way. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But there is a new project coming out on Novalis and his novel. But the claim I basically am trying to put forward is that all of these novels are what you could call illustrations of romantic myth making, the invention of a new mythology.
I want to just press you on the issue of the project with Novalis. I'm very interested in this work, or are you translating this piece, or are you writing a book on Novalis and his relation to philosophy or romantic mythology? What is this
Yeah,
project?
it's kind of top secret. I'll say a little bit, but it is forthcoming, and it's going to be a new translation of the novel with a critical study. It's going to be the largest book I've ever written. So it is the critical study is of the novel, Ofterdingen, but it's also situating the novel and Novalis within the broader horizons of post-Kantian Romanticism and Idealism. So I'm really excited to share news about that soon, but I'll leave that for another time.
Some of the concepts that the text are freedom, reason, unity. Um, how do you think all of these concepts, how are they employed throughout the entire text?
Mm. There's a sense in which these authors, I think, do have distinctive positions, and I don't want to claim that they are of one mind philosophically about everything. So to a certain extent, when you're sort of approaching the Romantics, you see certain points of overlap and commonalities. And what I found is that they all seem to think that you can look at the shape of human life individually and historically as going through a series of stages, starting from a kind of simple wholeness where there's an undifferentiated unity between self and not self, self and other, self and world. Then there's a kind of a fall into fragmentation where reason emerges, reflection emerges, and now we become disconnected. Now we're alienated. Now we're full of feelings of longing to become whole and complete, but we don't know how to satisfy that longing. And then there's a kind of a third stage, which is a sort of paradise regained or a wholeness regained, but it's qualitatively distinct from the original state of unity. The reason being, it's a unity that now encompasses complexity and differentiation and individuality. At the level of the self, it's a kind of a wholeness that has reason and sensibility now in a happy marriage, kind of united, working together, not at odds with each other. So you see, unity undergoes a certain kind of evolution where there's a simple unity and then there's a fall into fragmentation and then there's a kind of new unity, but it's really one that is complex and advanced. That's, I think, a sort of a pattern that you find a lot of the romantics holding. And it ties in with this theme that I try to bring out in the book, which is that the romantics' conception of human life is like a journey, and it's not a linear line, which is good news, right? We're progress is never a linear line. For everyone listening that's in grad school, you can relate. You know, you have good days and bad days. Progress is more erratic than a straight linear line, but nor is it a circle in which you're just coming back to the same spot, kind of like mechanically or mindlessly. This is not like a Sisyphean task, even though life might feel like that. So they think that really the journey is the shape of a spiral in which you're coming back, but at a higher vantage point. So it can sometimes feel like you're going back to an earlier stage, but really you're returning to some aspect of yourself or some aspect of human history with some kind of new insight, a new perspective, a new understanding. And so the idea is that working towards complex wholeness, I should have mentioned, it's a never-ending task. It's never like we've achieved the state and now we're good. It's rather this movement that's a spiral-like movement in which we're always kind of going out and coming back to ourselves. And we are trying to always work towards a state of harmony and balance and coordination. And it's a work in progress always.
Um, I want to thank you so much for navigate us through all of these complex themes in both German and British Romanticism, and really, really giving us a very rich and robust understanding of all of the main concepts and how much this text is, very timely for the era that we're now in. So thank you so much, Dr. Ware, for being here and discussing these ideas with us. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks so much. This was so much fun, and I look forward to future conversations with you.